Before we get started, I would like to make a few preliminary remarks. As resources for further consultation, I have added a reading list with material covered in this talk, and also a few additional items. I have also added a few questions you may do some research of your own on. A caveat is also in order here. I am heavily indebted to the work of Helmut Kreutz, and I am also his publisher of the German edition of The Money Syndrome. The English edition of his work is, at the time of this talk, not available yet as PDF, but I will try and make it available until the summer school starts. Kate Raworth proposes a groundbreaking metaphorical framework. In her book Donut Economics, she proposes to assess economic thinking picturing a donut. The outer ring of the donut consists of ecological restrictions. Roughly speaking, anything that is connected to our climate system will limit the operating space for all living beings. Climate problems are not only restricted to greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, as you can see by the array of terms denoted on the outside ring of the donut. The inner ring delineates the parameters that are necessary to uphold a certain amount of social stability within the system. Sustainable systems operate within the donut. Its participants don't fall prey to the urge to handle the ecological boundaries lightly, and they also pay attention to the necessary social structures that enable them to thrive rather than be subjected to utter poverty. Raworth's donut metaphor enables the economist to see quite clearly that social and ecological issues are inextricably linked. It is quite visible that we do have an operating space, but alas, it's not that big. If people stretch the ecological boundaries too much, they will fall off the edges. If the social system is not able to manifest a certain degree of stability, people will fall inwards. You can think of the donut turning into a well, and the middle of the donut turning into a bottomless pit. The subject of my talk is compound interest and international debt. On first sight, it may seem like a negligible technical subject that has no relation to the donut. However, it is my claim that our monetary system, especially compound interest, is constantly hijacking any kind of reasonable effort on the part of social and ecological initiatives to unfold efficiently. The talk has 4 parts. In the first part, I will offer some kind of monetary theory and highlight the problematic role of compound interest. A theoretical claim leads to nothing if it is not buttressed by some hard data. This I will provide in the second part. I will give you an ontology of some of the most interesting, albeit crushing, empirical findings. In the third part, I will present 2 long-term strategies and their economic consequences that have been suggested so far. You may call them blueprints for a sustainable monetary order. In the fourth part, I will offer different kinds of fire extinguishers that may be of certain value to mitigate the consequences of the current corona crisis. Let's start with some theoretical notes. The following thought experiment is by Helmut Kreutz. You are allowed to lock up one of the following 3 items in a safe for a month and keep it afterwards. What is your pick? Option number 1, a basket of fresh food. Option number 2, an array of competent workers that can perform any task you like. Option number 3, the exact amount of money to pay for option number 1 or option number 2. Of course, who would ever propose this kind of thing? But bear in mind that this is a thought experiment to make a certain point blatantly obvious. And this it does. I guess all of you have chosen the money. The fresh goods will have gone mouldy after a month, and our array of workers will have starved to death. The money is still as fresh as ever. What can we gather from this banal thought experiment? First, money is not a neutral facilitator of exchange, but a singular asset with special qualities. The superiority of money enables its owners to charge interest. It is the price of money, so to speak. Let's vary the experiment a little bit. If the safe was gone and you would pick directly, you wouldn't go for money if we were in a phase of hyperinflation. Also, if you were just starving to death and there was no other food available, you would probably pick the food. It is clear that external circumstances can directly affect the superiority of money. It is useful to think of money as some kind of a joker in a deck of cards. Its value consists of the ability to be able to take on any other value. In the following diagram, the different components of interest are depicted schematically. Interest consists of different parts. Let's have a look from left to right. An interest rate will be known by everyone as the percentage a bank charges for giving a credit. The debtor pays the bank a certain amount agreed upon as interest rate. What happens with this money? At first, the bank has to pay everyone depositing money a certain rate of interest. Then only the bank margin remains. From this margin, the bank has to pay all of its costs consisting of labour and materials. It will also calculate a certain amount of risk in case a debtor defaults a credit. After subtracting these costs, we receive the bank's earning that may then be subject to taxation, depending on the jurisdiction. I have no intention of downplaying the role of banks in financial crises, but for our purpose, we can see that the banks act rationally, have costs, and that their earnings may not be as big as you may think. On the side of the people depositing money, we have one part of real interest. The scarcity premium can be given by the principle of supply and demand. If the bank is in need of deposits, the scarcity premium will of course be higher. If we subtract this premium as a variable of the market, we receive the base interest rate. And this rate is one of the two culprits of our monetary order, as to be shown. The second culprit is inflation. What if we were able to construct a monetary order where interest and inflation were a relic of the past? Why is interest such a problem? If you are in debt, the interest you pay is an obvious burden. If you are not in debt, you may think interest is not a problem at all, as you don't pay any. This is not the case. In every product you buy, you pay interest. Let's have a look at a steel product and its different stages of production. In the beginning, someone has to mine ore. This person will have to pay workers and finance heavy machinery with a credit. If he takes up a credit, he will have to pay interest. The person producing the steel from the ore will then have to include these costs in the price he assigns to the steel when he sells it to the manufacturer who intends to work with the steel. This goes on till the very end, and the consumer, in retail, will have to pay every interest on every step. This may of course vary. If the product is simple, the costs will be less, and labor costs will be higher or lower at every production step. Of course, but think of a car or a building with thousands of production steps. Even labor has its costs, as somebody who is heavily in debt to finance one of his university degrees will also have to pay interest rates. And now bear in mind that most people do have proper debt that has added to their cost of living. In the following diagram, 3 different growth curves are depicted. Curve A, the green line, is the natural growth curve. Nearly every living organism grows along this line. After birth, growth is staggeringly quick. Think of a baby. Every organism has its optimal size, and most living beings stop growing after a certain period. Curve B, the blue line, depicts linear growth. Growth is steady, but it doesn't accelerate or slow down during the course of time. Curve C, the red line, is the exponential growth curve. Growth begins very slowly here, but takes off rapidly, and will eventually overtake the other 2 curves. As everyone acquainted with the ecological system knows, everlasting growth in a finite system is impossible, and it must be the goal of every economy to align itself to the natural growth curve. Now, what has interest got to do with this? Everything. Think of someone who has the best intentions to start a sustainable enterprise, like producing renewable energy or clothing. If that person takes up a credit that costs 2%, the person will have to grow more than 2% if he doesn't want to bite the dust in the long run. Now, what's with interests of 4 or 6% that compound? Wouldn't it be better if we could align our economic system alongside the natural growth curve? Let's have a look at some of the textbook definitions of money. If you open one of these textbooks, you will find that money has 3 functions. The first function is, of course, a medium of exchange. It is clear we use money to trade goods. The second function is a unit of account, and it is clear that we also use this function when we say this is worth €3 or £4 or $5. The third function is the value function or store function of money. If you think of Scrooge McDuck who dives into his vault, you can see that he uses money as a store of value. These textbook definitions seem somewhat sophisticated and useful for everyday life, but they are highly problematic when applied uncritically. The problems compound interest elicits are connected to the structure of our monetary order. Helmut Kreutz again pointed out the problems accurately. 1. Money is a public institution, but at the same time a private asset. It is surely the case that some central banks are difficult to be held accountable, but that isn't stopping citizens trusting most of the central banks, as they are all of them using the currency that they emit. 2. Forging money is strictly forbidden, but hoarding money and pulling it out of circulation is allowed. If you think of forging money in economical terms, it means increasing the amount of money that is in circulation, which equals inflation. Hoarding money will mean decreasing the amount of money and therefore deflation. Somehow, only the first is forbidden, but the second is allowed. You are even allowed to burn your money, as it is considered a private property. 3. Money is a legal tender, but at the same time, people are allowed to speculate with money at will. 4. Using money as a medium of exchange will cancel out the storage function, and vice versa. 5. Money is used as a unit of account, but its value isn't kept stable. Think of every other unit of account. Public institutions guard these units as sacred entities. What would people do if a meter wasn't a meter again and a litre wasn't a litre again? Evidently haven't got any problems with increasing its value or decreasing it. As we have seen before, money is coupled with compound interest, which leads to overwhelming exponential growth. In the following part, I have selected 4 charts created by Helmut Kreutz that illustrate certain consequences for our monetary order empirically. Each one of the charts have a certain degree of complexity, and I invite you to study them carefully, as the devil sometimes lies in the detail. State debt, the German case. One of the most prevalent facts of our times is that most states in the world are heavily in debt. What role does interest play here? In the following chart, the amount of state debt increase since the 1970s in Germany is depicted annually by the red blocks. As you can see clearly, the state debt has increased steadily every year, varying of course in magnitude, but never decreasing. The trend only changes beginning in 2012, where the state was for the first time after the Second World War able to pay back a significant amount of debt. The black line denotes the annual interest paid by the state. The amount of debt increase and interest payment are closely linked. The more interest the state has to pay, the more likely the debt will increase the next year. The white line at the bottom denotes the average rate of interest banks take in relation to the size of their balance sum. It is rather mind-boggling to see that the amount of actual interest paid to banks in all sectors is closely linked to annual debt. The even more mind-boggling fact that Helmut Kreutz arrived at in 2010, this was the last update of his chart, was that the amount of interest paid annually over the years amounts to the current state debt. This trend hasn't changed after I updated this chart the last time in 2018. It may seem a little arbitrary to single out interest payments as the culprit. It would be possible to make any other expenditure of the state responsible. But if you take, for example, medical care, education, science, or social security, these denote a real economic value for the citizens. Infrastructure and service is created, and wages are paid. What is to be said of the plus side for interest rates? The interest rate to the creditors of the state is the result of our monetary order. There is no product and service in the end, and there is no value for the citizens. In other words, if we had had a constant interest rate of 0 to 1%, think of what would have been possible with 2 trillion euros. The price of interest. The overall cost. How large is the interest burden for an economy as a whole? The German Bundesbank acts as the central bank for Germany within the European system of central banks. It also is a large research facility that publishes aggregated data on the banking sector regularly. Every September, the Bundesbank publishes an overview of the profitability of the banking sector in Germany. Helmut Kreutz collected these figures over the years and created the following chart. 3 different rates are depicted here. The blue line depicts the sum of interest banks take from every entity that took up a credit. The white line depicts the sum of interest the bank pays to every entity depositing money. Subtract the interest paid to depositors from the overall interest payment the bank receives from the creditors. We receive the bank margin from credit business. This is depicted by the black line. The hard numbers are truly revelatory. The bank margin is hardly affected by the ups and downs of the interest rates. Over the years, the bank margins haven't changed that much. As I have said earlier, I have no intention of downplaying the role large banks have played during the financial crisis and anywhere else. They are a force to be reckoned with. Regarding interest rates, however, they are neither the enemy nor the sole beneficiary. They remain indifferent regarding the actual amount of interest payments. Think about that the next time you read a large bank whining about negative interest rates. The amount of interest burden, signified by the blue line, is extremely relevant. One of the most mysterious facts of the last 10 years to me is that it is not regularly noted in the press as well as in economic journals that the interest burden from 2008 till today has decreased from a staggering 400 billion to roughly 160 billion. This is a sum the economy as a whole has benefited from low interest rates, over 250 billion. How are interest rates distributed among the population? This is, alongside the ecological effects of exponential growth, the core problem of our monetary system. If they were evenly distributed, this wouldn't constitute a problem at all. Interest received as interest given. This view was also voiced by this man here. What is the burden of interest anyway? The interest burden, financed by tax money, goes to those who hold the bonds. If we assume a pure internal debt, we owe the debt to ourselves. There is no real problem until the foreign share of the national debt becomes too great. The quote I picked out is arbitrary, of course, but Mr. von Weizsäcker is not a straw man. He is professor for macroeconomics and has published extensively. He should know better and couldn't be more wrong. The interest burden is distributed unevenly. The richest receive the most interest, the poorest none. We can't assume only an internal debt. Foreign debt is becoming a problem, especially for poor countries. Let's have a look at both of these points in a little bit more detail. I had to wrap my head around the next chart on the left side for about 3 months to grasp it and create the follow-up on the right side. For the purposes here, I can't delve into too much detail as time is restricted. However, I would like to highlight a few points. As you can read in the press regularly, wealth is distributed unevenly. If you want to receive hard figures, it's not that easy. You are dependent on extensive surveys, and there was also a good bit of reasonable guesswork involved. However, Helmut Kreutz came as close as ever in the following chart on the left side. Divide the population into 10 groups. The first group of households is the poorest. The 10th group is the richest. Each group has expenditure, which is signified by the grey bars in the background. From these expenses, it is possible to assume a certain amount of covert interest rate, as we have shown before. These will be, of course, included in the expenditures, and they are signified in this chart by the black bars. As you can see, every household group has expenditures, and every household pays covert interest rates. The poorer less, the richer more. So far so good. The wealthier the households get, the more assets they possess by definition. The interest gained is signified by the white bars. However, the 10th household is so rich that the interest gained trumps their overall expenditure. They have so much money that despite their honourable effort to spend money, there will be no chance at all that their overall assets will be reduced. As you can see, the first 4 poor household groups receive any interest at all, because, surprise, they're poor by definition. They only pay interest in their expenses. Households 5 to 8 make interest, but not enough to cover the interest paid. Household 9 breaks even. To say it more drastically, 80% lose this game. It's rigged. This was 2007. Switch to 2013. Interest rates are much lower now. Group 10 still wins, but not so blatantly as in 2007. In her writings, Susan George has pointed out for nearly 4 decades the crushing effects of debt on developing countries. I have linked 2 of her books in the reading list for further consultation. They are old books, but still very valuable to understand the power structures at work. Her criticism of structural adjustment programs on the sides of the IMF and the World Bank is in my view still correct, and her careful analysis of different topics spans more than we can cover here. If we have a look at the following quote, we can view the effects of interest rates on developing countries quite clearly. In The Debt Boomerang, she writes, total service payment received by banks between 1982 and 1989 amounted to 615 billion, both interest and amortization. This figure does not compare at all unfavourably with the total third world debt banks held in 1982, 493 billion, nor with the debt they held 7 years later, 629 billion. It is in fact astonishing that third world countries could pay their commercial creditors an average of nearly 77 billion per year, more than 6.4 billion a month, yet find themselves, as a group, fully 28% more in debt to these creditors than they were in 1982, in spite of a dearth of new lending. You can see interest rates at work here. The next quote touches ethical issues. How just is debt imposed as such? The debt has already been largely or entirely paid. The North is, in fact, substantially in debt to the South, since it has received, since 1982, the cheapest raw materials on record and the equivalent of the value of 6 Marshall Plans net from the indebted countries. The quote speaks for itself. As last topic of our empirical anthology, we will have a look at cash in 2 countries, Switzerland and the USA. Terminology contains metaphors, and metaphors can be misleading. Take as such the word currency. It is built upon the Latin word currere, which means run. The central banks use the term circulation, which implies a circle. If you are liquid, it is implied that money is flowing. However, money in cash is substantially hoarded, and the bigger the banknotes, the more this can be expected. The Swiss example on the right side is quite crass. The 1,000 franc banknote makes up 2/3 of the whole amount of cash emitted. Money used for everyday exchanges, however, usually the lower denotations of banknotes and coins, have also increased, but not that much. The biggest US banknote is $100, and the Federal Reserve has emitted more and more of these over the years. They make up about 3/4 of the whole amount of cash. In these examples, the central banker's dilemma unfolds. The central bank is responsible for supplying cash to its jurisdiction. However, people are allowed to hoard and pull money out of the circle. As a result, the central bank will print more cash to do its job. With low interest rates, the amount of cash hoarded increases, and this happens across borders. Foreign currency becomes a storage of value in unstable economies. The central bank has no effective measure to control the amount of money and its circulation at all. What are strategies to address these issues? As I said in the beginning, I would distinguish between short-term and long-term strategies. The distinction is somewhat arbitrary, as short-term strategies have long-lasting consequences, and long-term strategies sometimes have immediate effects. Think negative. As has been noted in the press, central banks all over the world have lowered their key interest rates. They have been widely criticized for this, but they are on the right track here. The low interest rates have, as we have seen earlier, benefited the social and environmental side of the economy substantially. Inequality decreases and the need to grow is reduced. Negative interest rates are a key strategy to stay within the donut. It is absolutely necessary that the bloated criticism towards the central banks is addressed with some of the figures myself and others have supplied. It is useful to understand the way central banking works. Regarding the European central banks, it is their 3 key interest rates. I will outline it roughly. banks are connected with the central banks via key interest rates. The white line is the most important one. This is the rate applied to main refinancing operations. Banks are allowed to borrow money from the European Central Bank at this rate. At the moment, 0%. Negative interest rates are applied to commercial banks if they fail to infuse excess money at the end of the day into the credit market. This puts pressure on them to optimize their credit business, and this pressure is good. At the moment, the rate is minus 0.5%, and it is enough to make commercial banks whine all the time. Strictly speaking, the term negative interest rate is only applicable to the blue line. The marginal lending facility, which is denoted by the black line, is a short-term lending option. The big banks are all able to borrow money at a slightly higher interest rate if necessary. This is seldomly used, but it is always available. Think of the key interest rates as a corridor. Banks walk along the hallway, and most of them walk along the white line. The blue and black line constitute walls. Banks have to operate within this corridor. This highlights that central banks, who are responsible for building this corridor in their jurisdiction, are key players when it comes to stay within the donut. The second option may seem absolutely counterintuitive if you haven't heard of it before. I thought the same way. We need a circulation fee on cash. In economic terms, this is called demurrage. We have seen that low and negative interest rates are beneficial to the economy as a whole. The problem we have, as also shown earlier, is that cash is hoarded and the money circulation is blocked at the very beginning. Even commercial banks are reported to hoard cash in their safes at the time of this talk, as they do not want to pay the deposit rate of 0.5%. This example shows that commercial banks use every method that is at their disposal and react, maybe only subliminally, to central banking operations. Employing a demurrage fee means assigning the joker advantage of money a cost. Let's have a look what this means for an economy as a whole. The following chart shows on the left side the state as it is, and ranks different means of deposits in a staircase. In reality, the state is already nearing the right side as we have already lower interest rates. Cash, the letter A, is superfluid. You don't receive any interest if you keep it under your pillow, but it has the advantage of being at hand. If you deposit cash in your account, you won't receive or hardly receive any interest at all. However, if you overdraw your account short-term wise, you will pay the highest interest rate for the bank. The margin is especially high here. The more you move towards long-term deposits and credits, the less interest the bank can charge and the more interest you potentially receive. The aggressiveness people employ to this thought is somewhat understandable. They feel cheated, especially if they are used to receive higher interest rates. They think alongside the black line. It is necessary, however, to think along the white line too. Now, let's employ a demurrage on cash, say 4%. The staircase wanders down 4 steps. The new demurrage fee, here employed as the white line, will have immediate effect on all the other depositions. Commercial banks may apply a negative interest rate on demand deposits, let's say 3%. As long as they have to keep cash in their vaults for people to withdraw at any point, they will face the off chance of paying the demurrage fee themselves. That's why their strategy will be to push deposits not needed toward long-term deposits. On the plus side for consumers, the cost of credit will drop rapidly. Long-term credits may be available at 1% interest rate, exactly the amount of money the bank receives as a charge for their intermediary services. Again, this is counterintuitive. Please think hard about what may happen before you reach a verdict. There have been a plethora of short-term strategies to counter the current corona crisis. I have 3 to offer. 1. Debt extension and debt relief. Debt as such is not that bad if interest rates are 0. It may be the time to transform standing debt contracts to contracts with lower interest rates and to think of debt relief. This will scratch the reputation of states as debtors, for sure. But there is a chance at the moment that some states will completely default their debts anyway. For creditors, this is also the worst case, as they lose everything. 2. Financial transaction tax. The idea of a financial transaction tax has been going around for decades now. The corona crisis has pointed out the cracks in our economy, quite frankly. One is for sure. Derivative traders and speculators are not necessary to sustain an economy. And maybe now is the time to use all the energy available to enforce a transaction tax on finance. 3. Swenson-Gesell money. Roger Swenson has developed an idea that combines short-term relief and a demurrage fee. He proposes to emit a certain amount of money towards every household and make it evaporate within a short time period. Of course, this money will drive good money out according to Gresham's law. But Sweden is open to digital currency as legal tender, and there will be technical difficulties for other countries. But in my view, it is worth a try. I have linked a paper in the reading list, alas in German.